Sit down. Everyone, Calvin Rhodes said, raising one hand as if conducting an orchestra. This won't take long. I was still standing when he looked straight at me and added, Actually, it will be very short for Amara. A few nervous laughs rippled across the room before anyone understood what he meant. He turned to the screen behind him, a deck already queued. Effective immediately. We're removing Amara Flynn's position to align with our new strategic direction. He didn't look at me when he said my name. He looked at the room. Then came the applause. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't polite. It was enthusiastic, relieved, almost grateful. I felt it land on my skin like static. I was still the director of strategic partnerships, at least for the length of that sentence. I was the one who worked directly with our biggest partners, the one they called when trust needed repairing instead of selling. Calvin waited for the clapping to fade, smiling like he'd just proven a theory. We're modernizing, he continued. We need scalable systems, not legacy dependency. His eyes flicked toward me for half a second. And relationships don't scale. Someone nodded. Someone else wrote it down. I'd spent years sitting across conference tables, convincing skeptical partners to stay. Smoothing damage caused by executives who promised speed instead of substance. I built confidence quietly, without slides, without slogans. That didn't fit Calvin's vision. New CEO. He came from consulting. He believed clarity lived in charts and authority lived in confidence. This isn't personal, he added, which made it exactly that. It's progress. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Nothing I said would survive the applause. The decision had already been celebrated. I gathered my notebook, ignored the envelope HR slid closer, and walked out without shaking anyone's hand. No one followed. No one stopped me. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone vibrated. A message from one of the primary partners tied to the pending merger. Are you still with the company? I stared at the words, realizing the room applauded something they didn't understand yet. If you're listening right now, check in with yourself for a moment. Are you feeling okay today? When this part ends, try opening a window and letting some natural light into the room. It's a small reset that actually helps your mood more than you think. Tell me where you're listening from. I always read those messages. And if this story already feels familiar, stay with me and consider subscribing. Because what happened after that applause is where everything truly began. I didn't build trust loudly. I built it the slow way, one quiet decision at a time, often after everyone else had left the room. While executives chased momentum, I stayed behind to clean up what speed broke. That was my real job. Even if my title never captured it, I met partners privately, without cameras or decks, listening long enough for them to say what they actually meant. When contracts strained, I didn't escalate first. I explained context, accepted blame when the company deserved it, and fixed problems before they hardened into exits. During crises, I absorbed pressure so leadership could pretend stability. I protected the company's reputation when it was easiest for others to deny responsibility. That work didn't look impressive in meetings. It didn't produce slogans, but it produced continuity, more than once. Partners insisted I be present in every discussion that mattered. They trusted me because I never surprised them, never vanished when things went wrong, never hid behind policy language. Calvin Rhodes had a different philosophy. He believed confidence could substitute for history and volume could replace consistency. To him, people were variables, interchangeable if the process was elegant enough. He spoke in broad statements, liked hearing himself simplify complex relationships into bullet points. He talked about leverage without understanding what held it. He'd never met our primary partners face to face. He inherited them and assumed loyalty came bundled with the acquisition. When I suggested a joint visit, he waved it off. We don't need to overinvest emotionally, he said once. Smiling like that was wisdom. After the meeting, where I was applauded out of the company, HR called me into a glass-walled office. The representative avoided eye contact and slid a document across the table. I was instructed not to contact any external partners. Effective immediately, no clarification, no exceptions. Just a reminder about professionalism. It felt less like a policy and more like erasure. Years of earned trust reduced to a liability that needed containment. I signed nothing. I asked no questions. I left with my self-respect intact, but bruised, compressed into silence. Later that afternoon, an email notification appeared on my screen, a calendar invite for an upcoming M&A alignment call, one I had attended every week for months. I opened it out of habit. The agenda was still there. The attendees had shifted. My name was gone. They were moving forward without me, pretending the structure could hold once the builder stepped away. I closed the laptop slowly, feeling the anger settle, contained, waiting for its moment. I realized then that dignity, once stripped publicly, has a way of returning through consequences no one can stop quietly eventually. I stopped looking for leverage in documents once I understood where it actually lived. I didn't own the contracts. My name wasn't embedded in clauses or protections. There was no forgotten appendix waiting to save me. On paper, I was replaceable, cleanly removable, legally silent. That realization didn't panic me. It clarified everything. What I did have was quieter. Years of shared context. Patterns learned the hard way. Trust built through consistency rather than persuasion. I was the person partners called when the deal language stopped matching reality. Not because I controlled outcomes, but because I understood consequences. That kind of trust doesn't transfer with a title change. Once I saw that clearly, the temptation to intervene disappeared. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't reach out. I didn't try to protect the company from its own decisions. Doing nothing wasn't surrender. It was discipline. The system had already been set in motion. Interfering would only blur the cause. Calvin, meanwhile, filled the silence aggressively. He sent emails to our partners filled with reassuring phrases and confident forecasts. Strong alignment, streamlined leadership, continuity assured. He copied half the executive team, as if volume could substitute for familiarity. The messages read like presentations stripped of slides, confident in tone but hollow in substance. I watched without reacting. This wasn't my role anymore, and I respected that boundary. Power, I'd learned, isn't always about presence. Sometimes it's about knowing when absence will speak louder. I let the gap remain unfilled. A day passed, then another. Meetings continued without me, but they felt thinner, rushed. Questions circled without landing. Decisions were deferred instead of confirmed. The confidence Calvin projected started to sound rehearsed, even to himself. Then the message arrived, forwarded quietly through internal channels. One line, polite and precise. The partners requested to postpone the final signature meeting. No accusation, no urgency, just a pause. That pause said more than confrontation ever could. It meant trust had noticed the change. It meant certainty had weakened. I closed my inbox and sat back, calm and clear. I hadn't pulled a lever. I had simply stepped away from the one no one else realized was holding the weight. I understood then that true leverage rarely announces itself. It waits, patient and invisible, until pressure tests the structure built around it. By removing myself cleanly, I allowed that structure to reveal its weaknesses without interference. There was no satisfaction in it, only clarity. The outcome no longer depended on my voice, my effort, or my defense. It depended entirely on whether trust could survive being ignored. That knowledge steadied me, replaced anger with precision, and confirmed that silence, applied correctly, can be decisive over time always. At this point, many people think they can predict the story they're usually wrong. The silence didn't arrive dramatically, it settled in slowly. The way unease does when nothing is technically wrong, but nothing moves forward either. I noticed it the morning the signing was delayed by a single day. 24 hours. Officially, it meant nothing. Unofficially, it meant everything had begun to hesitate. I stayed home. Not out of fear or defeat, but because there was nothing to add. I read the delay notice once, then closed my laptop. My role was finished, and I respected that boundary with discipline. Silence, when chosen deliberately, requires restraint. It also sharpens awareness. Every hour that passed without clarity confirmed what I already sensed. Inside the company, Calvin reacted differently. He projected calm, but it sounded forced now. He began calling people who hadn't mattered before: lawyers, advisors, consultants who specialized in reassurance. I could imagine the conversations without hearing them. He would ask how to accelerate confidence, how to restore momentum, how to keep the narrative intact. The board, however, didn't speak in narratives. They asked direct questions. Why were they hesitating? What had changed in the last 48 hours? Calvin answered carefully, using broad phrases instead of specifics. Temporary scheduling issue, normal diligence, minor alignment delay. He spoke as if certainty could be rebuilt through repetition. From my side of the silence, the contrast was sharp. I did nothing. I didn't refresh my inbox obsessively. I didn't draft explanations that would never be sent. I allowed the pause to exist on its own terms. Anxiety surfaced, then receded. What remained was a steady awareness that this was no longer about me personally. It was about the absence they were beginning to feel but couldn't yet define. By late afternoon, the delay was discussed again internally. Another meeting without conclusions. Another round of confident statements that lacked traction. Calvin was still certain he could talk his way through it. That belief, more than the delay itself, felt risky. The email arrived quietly, forwarded without commentary. It was short, polite, and intentionally vague. The partners requested additional time to ensure internal alignment before proceeding. No deadlines, no accusations, just distance. I read it twice, then closed the message. The unease I felt wasn't satisfaction. It was recognition. Silence had finally produced a response, and it wasn't one that could be argued with. Alignment isn't something you negotiate into existence. It's something you either have or you don't. And in that moment, I knew the hesitation would not resolve itself easily, because the trust that once anchored it was no longer present at the table. That realization sat with me quietly, steady and unresolved, signaling that the pause was only the beginning for everyone. Every assumption so far makes sense, until the next part begins. Calvin treated the delay like a chess move he had already anticipated. When the board questioned him, he smiled and said it was a negotiation tactic. Nothing more. Buyers hesitate to gain leverage, he explained, and confident sellers don't blink. He spoke with the ease of someone who had rehearsed certainty more than he had tested it. Inside the company, pressure replaced patience. Calendars were tightened. Deadlines were pulled forward. Calvin ordered teams to accelerate preparation, to demonstrate momentum rather than wait for clarity. Speed, in his mind, would force confidence back into place. The louder the motion, the less anyone would notice what was missing. From where I sat, the reaction felt familiar and hollow. I stayed deliberately distant, answering no messages, offering no insight. When an intermediary reached out with a polite request for short-term consulting support, I declined without explanation, not out of bitterness, but because involvement would distort the signal. Silence only works when it is complete. Calvin interpreted my refusal as leverage. He told the board I was attempting to insert myself back into relevance. He dismissed the idea that my absence mattered structurally. People were interchangeable, he insisted. Relationships transferable with the right framework. He doubled down on that belief, confident the partners would follow the process. They didn't. The next request came from the other side. The partners asked to meet with someone familiar, someone who understood the history of the relationship. The phrasing was careful, respectful, intentionally vague. Calvin responded by offering alternatives, senior leaders with impressive titles and detailed resumes. He framed it as an upgrade. The answer came back unchanged. They appreciated the options, but they wanted continuity. The word lingered longer than it should have. That was the moment I heard the shift in his voice. Not panic yet, but irritation sharpened by doubt. He reread the message too many times, looking for a loophole, finally. He asked the question no one else would say aloud. Who exactly were they referring to? No one answered him directly. They didn't have to. I felt no triumph in that realization, only distance, the cold clarity of understanding how badly the signal had been misread. Calvin believed force would correct hesitation. He believed authority could replace familiarity. I knew better. Trust doesn't respond to pressure, it withdraws from it. As the day ended, emails multiplied without resolution. The partners weren't escalating. They weren't threatening. They were simply waiting. That waiting exposed the flaw Calvin refused to see. He thought the deal was stalled by strategy. In truth, it was stalled by absence. And for the first time since the applause, he understood exactly whose absence that was, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The silence between messages stretched, heavy and instructive, revealing consequences he could no longer control. The line arrived without ceremony, buried in an otherwise polite email thread. No escalation, no threats, no legal language, just one sentence. Clean and final. We're not comfortable proceeding without the person we've been working with. I read it slowly, then again, feeling a controlled sense of satisfaction settle in. Not joy, not revenge, something colder, confirmation. That sentence did what no argument could. It drew a boundary Calvin couldn't negotiate around. He reacted immediately. Calls went out. Advisors were looped back in. Calendars reshuffled again. The pace inside the company spiked, tension rising with every unanswered question. This time, speed didn't look confident. It looked frantic. Calvin tried me next. The call came late in the afternoon, his name lighting up my screen like a test I had already passed. I let it ring once before declining. Minutes later, a message followed, professional, measured. He wanted to talk. Just a quick conversation, he wrote, as if familiarity could be recreated on demand. I responded politely. I thanked him for reaching out. I told him I wasn't available. No explanation, no conditions. Courtesy without access. That was all I owed. And legally. It was more than enough. He had no grounds to push further. I was no longer employed. There was no consulting agreement, no transition clause, no obligation to clarify, justify, or soften the outcome. Silence wasn't obstruction. It was compliance. Every lawyer in that building knew it. Inside the company, the atmosphere shifted from denial to calculation. Calvin attempted to reframe the message for the board, calling it a preference, not a requirement. He argued that comfort could be rebuilt, that people adjusted, that deals evolved, but the certainty he once projected had thinned. Words were starting to echo instead of land. I stayed still. The satisfaction wasn't personal. It came from watching a system encounter a limit it couldn't override. Authority couldn't replace trust. Pressure couldn't manufacture it. The line had been drawn, and everyone could see it now. By evening, another detail surfaced quietly. The exclusivity window was closing. 48 hours remained. Not a threat. A fact. One Calvin couldn't spin. That countdown changed everything. Advisors stopped offering theories and started asking what was realistically possible. The board stopped asking why and started asking how much damage could be contained. Calvin, for the first time, stopped talking altogether. I sat with the stillness, aware of the tension tightening elsewhere. The satisfaction didn't grow louder. It stayed precise. The line had been crossed earlier, during applause. Now it was simply being acknowledged. And with the clock running, I understood that no amount of urgency would reopen a door that trust itself had chosen to close. If you think you've seen everything, stay with me for one more part. The boardroom fractured faster than anyone expected. What had been confident discussion turned sharp, voices overlapping as certainty evaporated. I wasn't there, but the reports came to me in fragments, each one heavier than the last. The merger was no longer a projection, it was a liability, and everyone knew it. The first crack came when the lawyers refused to commit. One of them said it plainly. We can't certify the risk without clarity from the other side. No hedging, no optimism, just absence. The room went quiet long enough for anger to replace confusion. Directors began to choose sides, some demanding urgency, others demanding restraint. Both knew the clock was running. Calvin tried to take control the way he always did, by reframing the narrative. This is legacy culture pushing back, he said, tapping the table. They're uncomfortable with change. He spoke louder, as if volume could turn theory into fact. When that didn't work, he pivoted to solutions. He proposed new faces, impressive resumes, executives who could step in seamlessly. We'll show them continuity, he insisted. The lawyers didn't argue. They just didn't agree. One of them shook his head and said, replacing a trust anchor isn't mitigation. The phrase landed hard. Calvin's jaw tightened. He accused the room of hesitation, of letting fear dictate outcomes. Someone fired back. Fear isn't the issue. Exposure is. I heard later that tempers flared. A director slammed a folder shut. Another demanded to know why this risk hadn't been identified earlier. Calvin blamed outdated thinking, relationships that had grown too personal. He said dependency was the real flaw. No one applauded this time. Then came the refusal. The partners declined to meet the proposed replacement. No explanation beyond a brief note thanking the team for the introduction and stating they preferred to continue discussions with someone familiar. The word familiar echoed through the room like an accusation. Calvin read it twice, then again, searching for ambiguity. There was none. That was the moment panic took hold. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The board stopped debating strategy and started arguing responsibility. Calvin's authority weakened with every unanswered question. The structure he relied on began to fail under scrutiny. From where I stood, distant and silent, the collapse felt inevitable. The anger wasn't about me anymore. It was about control slipping away. They had tried to substitute trust with force and titles. The refusal made it clear that no amount of authority could compel belief. The boardroom cracked because it was built on confidence, not understanding, and the pressure finally exposed the difference. By the end, voices fell into bitter silence, the kind that follows blame. Nothing was resolved, only exposed. The meeting adjourned without decisions, leaving anger suspended in the air, heavy and unresolved, waiting for consequences to arrive soon enough. I knew the window was closing before anyone said it out loud. I felt it in the tone of the internal updates. Shorter now, stripped of optimism. Exclusivity doesn't end with drama, it expires quietly, like confidence. When the 72 hours were over, nothing happened. No signatures, no announcements, just absence where certainty was supposed to be. The deal didn't fail in a meeting, it simply reached the end of its allotted belief. That was the moment justice arrived. Calm and unannounced. Cold, final. It asked nothing from me and demanded nothing back. I learned about the expiration the same way everyone else did, indirectly. A calendar cleared. A legal notice circulated. The exclusivity period had ended without execution. Inside the company, reactions came in waves. Stock dipped first, sharp and visible. Analysts adjusted their language. Cautious, speculative. Employees refreshed dashboards they didn't fully understand. No one celebrated restraint anymore. The cost of certainty became measurable within minutes. Justice didn't raise its voice. It let numbers speak. And the numbers were unforgiving. They traced consequence to arrogance without naming it directly. Markets understand confidence better than excuses ever will. Especially moments now. The media followed quickly. Not with accusations, but with questions. Why had the merger stalled? What had changed so suddenly? Official responses avoided details. Spokespeople cited alignment issues and evolving priorities. Privately, a different explanation began circulating. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't strategic. It was emotional. Confidence had thinned. Trust had been disrupted. That language traveled faster than facts. By afternoon, A leak hardened into consensus. Deal collapsed due to loss of confidence. It wasn't framed as blame, just observation, which made it harder to fight. Cold explanations survive scrutiny longer than dramatic defenses. Everyone in leadership knew that now. I remained outside all of it, watching consequences propagate without interference. No calls came to me anymore. No apologies followed. The silence had matured into outcome. I felt no urge to insert myself back into the story. The resolution didn't require my presence. It required my absence. That distinction mattered. Justice, I realized, doesn't rush. It waits for pressure to expose weak assumptions. Then it moves. Clean. Unarguable. The applause that removed me had also removed certainty. It just took 72 hours to become visible. Enough time for truth to finish the sentence. Without interruption. When the dust settled, nothing dramatic followed. No reinstatement, no confrontation, no victory speech. The company moved into containment mode. Calvin's certainty evaporated quietly. Mine remained intact. I understood then that power isn't proven by applause. It's revealed when belief withdraws. The deal didn't collapse because I acted. It collapsed because trust noticed it had been dismissed. That was enough. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise or recognition. Sometimes it concludes things quietly, leaving no appeal, and nothing left to argue. Only consequences standing where confidence once lived. That lesson remained. The applause didn't echo anymore. It faded into something quieter, heavier, like dust settling after collapse. I wasn't in the boardroom, but I could feel the shift through messages and pauses. Satisfaction arrived without celebration, followed by a calm that surprised me. Nothing needed saying. Consequences were doing the work. Inside the company, the mood shifted from damage control to quiet accountability. Board members stopped posturing and started asking who approved which decisions. Calvin sat through questions without allies, confidence draining with each answer. No one defended him. No one mentioned my name. Silence handled the correction efficiently and calmly. I learned later that the vote was brief. No speeches, no dramatic exits. Calvin's position dissolved under simple math, credibility lost. Risk elevated. Leadership questioned. By evening, his access was limited. By morning, his title followed. The same room that applauded him accepted the outcome without protest or hesitation now. I wasn't invited to observe the reckoning, and I didn't expect to be. Justice didn't require witnesses. It required correction. I felt satisfied, not triumphant. What settled over me was stillness, earned and intact. The system adjusted itself once pressure revealed what competence could not replace on its own. A few days later, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. A partner I trusted spoke carefully, respectfully. They weren't revisiting the past. They were offering something new, a separate project, smaller scale, cleaner terms, built on familiarity, not spectacle. I listened without interrupting and considered it. I accepted after thinking it through, not out of revenge, but alignment. There were no announcements, no headlines, just work beginning again, under clearer conditions. The applause that once erased me had faded completely. In its place remained something steadier. Trust, rebuilt slowly, where it belonged without noise or consent. I never heard Calvin say my name again. The correction erased the need. His reputation didn't collapse publicly. It thinned quietly, credibility draining through corridors and contacts. That felt appropriate. Real consequences rarely announce themselves. They spread through professional memory, altering decisions long after meetings end, leaving nothing to refute. As for me, I returned to a familiar rhythm without the weight of pretense. I chose partners deliberately, spoke plainly, and set boundaries early. The work felt honest again, not larger, not louder, but grounded. The calm that followed wasn't victory. It was balance restored, finally earned through consequence alone. The story didn't end with applause or blame. It ended with clarity. When trust leaves a room, it doesn't argue. It simply stops supporting the structure. What remains either stands on truth or collapses on confidence alone. That difference decided everything here, long before anyone noticed. And after noise disappeared, I didn't walk away feeling victorious. I walked away finished. Finished with proving, defending, and explaining work that had already spoken for itself. The weeks after the collapse were quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty. I chose a smaller path, one defined by clarity instead of scale, and it fit me better than the one I'd been pushed out of. The new work came without ceremony. No press releases, no promises inflated for momentum, just conversations, expectations stated plainly, and mutual respect built from the start. I set boundaries early and kept them. Trust grew again, not because I demanded it, but because I protected it. That was the difference this time. I didn't confront Calvin. I didn't need an apology or an admission. Consequences had already delivered what arguments never could. His exit resolved nothing personally for me, but it completed the arc. Justice doesn't require proximity. It requires alignment. And that had already occurred. What stayed with me was the lesson the applause revealed too late. Authority can dismiss a person, but it can't command belief. Confidence borrowed from a room fades fast when trust decides to leave. I hadn't taken anything with me deliberately. I had simply carried what was never owned by the company to begin with. Now, my days move with intention. I listen more than I speak. I commit carefully. I walk away when alignment isn't there. That restraint feels like freedom. The noise is gone, replaced by work that holds its shape under pressure. Nothing dramatic followed. Only steady progress, honest conversations, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing my value was finally measured by trust. Not applause or fear anymore in my chosen work life. They applauded when I was fired. They didn't realize the trust walked out with me when everything ended. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. What this experience taught me is simple and uncomfortable titles can be removed in a sentence. But trust takes years to build and seconds to lose. I learned that dignity isn't defended by arguing louder, it's protected by consistency, restraint, and knowing when silence carries more truth than explanation. There were moments I felt small, erased, even humiliated. But living through that taught me something deeper about self-respect. If you know what you've built, you don't need a room to agree with you. As you were listening, what detail stayed with you the most? The applause, the silence, or the moment the deal quietly collapsed? And where are you listening from right now? I'd really like to hear. If this story resonated, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need it, and consider liking and subscribing. Stories like this matter because they remind us we're not alone. Remind us we're not alone. Remind us we're not alone.